assumed that you said yours before you left.
It was one of the controversial things when we had ours.
Y'all didn't do prayers either?
We did.
You did prayers?
We did.
Oh, wow.
And that created quite a stink.
Okay. A stink?
Oh, yeah.
How, why?
Oh, one man wanted freedom from religion.
Okay. And y'all didn't consider that an option?
And that we must not impose blah, blah, blah. It's interesting. Okay, let's see.
Sorry? 24th Town Hall meeting of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. We want to apologize to you for the very late start, but as I indicated to those of you in the room, our chairman is much delayed and we were waiting on him to make some remarks. He will now make them at the end of the evening. So I'm going to start, I'm going to invite one of our chairman, one of our commissioners who is outside, to just come in, Dr. Chandler, and we will start with the national anthem, and then we will go to our general remarks and get our panel started. Thank you. Please be seated.
How are you?
Hey, thanks. How are you?
Just saying I was a few minutes here.
So good evening again. We are now ready to start. I want to begin by indicating that our sign language interpreter this evening is Paula Medford. For the last few evenings, we've had Bonnie Leonce, but you're going to see a new face this evening, and our streaming services are being provided by Oversight, who have really been excellent. The Oversight team has been excellent so far. I want to start rather by introducing our panel, by introducing the members of the Commission. As you know, this is, as I said at the start, the fourth town hall meeting. We've had what we called a public education session, and that has been followed by 3 further town halls. And we've been at the BWU headquarters. We have gone to the east at Princess Margaret. We were in the south at the Foundation School, and now we are in the north. The members of the commission, which started its work in June, and I'm going to ask them to stand when I call their names and just sort of look around so that you can see who they are, because I don't think you've met everyone yet. I will start with our secretary, Pedro Eastman, the Clerk of Parliament, Attorney at Law. And present this evening as well, who services us when Pedro is out of the island, is our Deputy Clerk of Parliament, Ms. Beverly Gibbons, also Attorney at Law. Our deputy chairman is Sir Roy Trotman. We have Dr. William Hines.
Chandler.
Oh, Dr. William Chandler. Sorry, William. Yes, I am. Dr. Richard Ishmael. Coming later is an attorney at law, Mr. Corey Beckles, and this is the team that has been working on this matter. I want to, you know, I know. I'm not quite that forgetful. I haven't forgotten. In the audience, so I'm saying everything that is on this side of the room, so that when I come to this side of the room, we will not be returning there for a while. Let me also recognize the presence of former Ambassador John Beale, Barbados' former ambassador to DC, to the United States. And sitting next to him is Senator Andwele Boyce. And clearly I'm breaching all protocol here because I should have started with the Honorable Chantal Monroe Knight, Minister in the Prime Minister's office. Sir Richard's, the wife of the chairman, Lady Cheltenham, is with us, and Ms. Susan Hamblin, who works with the commission as well, is also present on that side of the room. So I have introduced those on this side, and now I come to the head table. I'm going to start. I'm going to start on my extreme right with Ms. Maxine McLean, specialist in management and former senator of Barbados. On her left is Ms. Vera Brathwaite, attorney at law. On her left is Dr. Richard Cheltenham, Sir Richard Cheltenham, who is chairman of the commission. On extreme left, my extreme left, is Dr. Sandra Osheng Springer, who is a lecturer in government and politics at the University of the West Indies. And on her right, immediately next to me, is a former president of the Senate, Ms. Carrie-Ann Eiffel. Of course, you know that Sir Richard is himself a former president of the Senate. I am Liz Thompson, the current deputy president of the Senate. This is your panel this evening, and I want to share with you the topic. As you know, we have been trying to really drill down to interrogate this whole question of Parliament, what it means to Barbados, its role, how we need to reform it, if at all, now that we are a republic, how we can make it more meaningful, give citizens a greater voice, and make it a stronger institution which is more representative of a broader cross-section of Barbadians. This evening's topic, the role of the Senate. Is it an outdated talk shop or a useful institution? How can it be made more inclusive of citizens' voices and broader interests, thereby enlarging our democracy? Should its present composition and structure be maintained? And we are going to look at the issue of the underrepresentation of women in both houses of Parliament. To make our opening remarks, I invite our chairman, attorney at law, and former president of the Senate, Sir Richard Cheltenham, to address you. Yes. Can you come forward to the microphone, please?
So, good night, ladies and gentlemen. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. I greet you most warmly, both those of you who are here with us at the Alexander School and those joining us online. Madam Ambassador and member of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Senator Elizabeth Thompson, who chairs tonight's session, fellow Commission members, tonight's presenters, ladies and gentlemen. My focus in brief remarks will be on the Senate, raising the question whether it is an outdated talk shop or useful institution which should be retained and maintained. I thought I would provide quite briefly the historical background to the Senate in the hope that it would assist in assessing the critical question posed for tonight's presentations. Is it an outdated talk shop or a useful institution? Barbados has had a bicameral or two houses of Parliament ever since 1639. I had long read that Barbados has the third oldest Parliament, Great Britain, Bermuda, and Barbados, but I didn't appreciate until recently that our Parliament goes back as far as 1639. The lower chamber, or the House of Assembly, and the upper chamber, which for centuries until 1964 was known as the Legislative Council. And it was only after some 325 years had passed, in a major constitutional change in 1964, that the Legislative Council became known as the Senate. At one stage, the Legislative Council had only 8 members, and that number increased over time, and in 1964, it was increased to 21. Currently, the leader of the opposition is allowed to appoint 2 of the 21 senators, while the government appoints 12. The other 7 senators are appointed by the president. One view is that even if the opposition gets no seats in the House of Assembly, and that has happened twice times in recent years, but gets at least 20% of the popular vote, at least 4 seats should be provided the opposition in the Senate. And that view is intended to take care of the situation which occurred twice in recent years where the opposition got no seats at all. I should mention that the commission headed by Sir Henry Ford, a 10-man constitutional review commission in 1998, recommended that the Senate should retain its 21 members. It went on to suggest that if there was no leader of the opposition, as happened after 2 recent general elections, 6 senators should be appointed by the president acting in her discretion, or his discretion as the case may be, and after consultation with a leader of any political party which was supported in the election by votes of at least 10% of those who voted. I do not myself like the percentage to be as low as 10% because it may encourage a lot of splinter groups to get at least 10% to get some form of recognition. And I would put that percentage myself as more like 15 or 20%. Otherwise, we may have parties competing in a general election to get only 10%. and get some form of official recognition. 3 senators are appointed by the President acting in her discretion after consulting with persons whom the President considers ought to be represented in the Senate. That was part of the proposal ever since 1990, the Henry Ford 10-man Constitutional Review Commission. The recommendation was, if I may repeat, 12 senators to be appointed by the Prime Minister, 6 represented by the opposition, provided they get 10% of the votes, and 3 independent senators whom the President considers suitable to be appointed. But that proposal by the Henry Ford Commission was never put into law, but it certainly represents an idea which anticipated some of what took place in the last 2 elections and should be considered, even if amendments, as I have suggested. And we need to act soon with it, because having occurred twice times, we cannot say it will never happen again. We simply have a duty to provide for that eventuality. And as I said earlier, it would be appropriate to consider whether 10% is not too low, as suggested by the Ford Commission, and it should not rather be a 20%. I would be concerned against encouraging splinter groups to try to get 10% of the votes and then make claims for representation in the Senate. It would be appropriate, too, to consider whether there should be a Senate at all. Some people are of that view, and we have to address all views. We may not agree with many, but we have a duty to look at all viewpoints. And there is a view that the Senate should not be appointed at all. And those who express that view ask, I think, in innocence, a related question: does it play a useful role? In my view, the upper house, or the Senate, has always played a useful role in our parliamentary structure by allowing the government of the day to bring into the Senate, so-called since 1964, persons who have specialized knowledge and experience, but who have no interest in elective politics, but can make a vital contribution to the public life of the country. I can think of a person like Luther Thorne, who served as the Minister of Education from 58 to 61 via the Legislative Council. This leads to these questions, which are among the many issues which we need to look at. Should the Senate be fully nominated, as it has been from 1639 to date, or should it be partly nominated and partly elected? I myself have heard that viewpoint expressed not once or twice, but a few times. Another question which we have to look at is, should there be no Senate at all? That is the abandonment of the second chamber and have a unicameral system. There are some who support that view. Speaking for myself, I do not support that view. My own view is that if we wish to have a more inclusionary society at the representational and parliamentary level, the Senate is necessary to make sure that no category of Barbadian who has a contribution to make is denied, whether it's the handicapped, the elderly, members of the LGBTQ community, the youth, women, who in many respects are underrepresented in Parliament. But all of them, as we fight to have a more inclusionary society, should be accommodated. And the route to accommodate them is the route through the Senate, in my respectful view. Commenting briefly on the House, we need to provide an uneven number of seats so as to avoid an election result in which each side has, for example, we are currently 15 each. So we've just concluded the election, each side has 15, and we have a major constitutional crisis on our hands. That too needs to be addressed. I do not favor taking away any constituency, so we must have a House of 31 or 33 members, but the number must not be even. It must be uneven. I thought by way of opening remarks I would share some of these ideas which I have just done. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward from hearing from the presenters from here on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sir Richard. And with that, we are off to our start. I just want to make some observations before we move to the panel. First of all, we have a very skilled and well-qualified panel, but I need to tell you that the views expressed by the panelists are their personal and professional opinions and not those of the Commission. We are here to stimulate your own thoughts and to hear all views. I want to make it clear to the public that the Commission has not come to any conclusions on any matters. We may have strong views and we do have vigorous discussion, but we are not yet at the stage where we have started to deliberate because we are still taking the views and opinions of the public, and we want your views to inform our decisions. I should also let you know, because I think it is of interest, that we've had roughly 300 people online at the first two meetings. Last week, our numbers jumped up to 400. And for the views after the meeting, between the first two meetings, we had 7,829 people. And last week, 3,142 people viewed the town hall meeting after the event. So there is some interest. People are making comments online. There is a level of discussion, and we are urging you to share with your friends and relatives, be present with us, either in the hall or online, to give your views. It is important. This is the first time that we are actually having an opportunity to shape what our Parliament looks like, and the views of every Barbadian are valued, valuable, and will be taken into consideration. So this is an important exercise in our governance system, and we are looking forward to very enthusiastic participation from the general public. With that, I move to my panel. I'm going to ask the former President of the Senate, Ms. Carrie Ann Eiffel, to give us her remarks, and then I will move to Dr. Springer for the more academic, or is that going to be a more practical perspective? Well, we have a political practitioner, I think, or senator on the left, and an academic on her left, and then I will move to the right side of the table. Ms. Eiffel?
Good evening, everyone. Sir Richard Cheltenham, former President and Chairman of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Deputy President of the Senate, Ms. Elizabeth Thompson, and moderator for this evening, fellow panelists, members of the Commission of the Parliamentary Reform, ladies and gentlemen, and of course our online viewers, I wish you a very good evening. I too will begin by putting a caveat in place, and that is to say that while I represent many diverse groups, I am also a member of the Constitution Reform Commission, but the views I express this evening are my own. They are not to be interpreted as those of the Constitution Reform Commission. Our work is still ongoing, and therefore you do not go away with the impression that this is what you're going to see. These are my views. With that firmly stated and in place, let me begin by saying, in 2008, I began a path that I had never anticipated, a path that took me for 10 years to the upper chamber of our Parliament. I served in the capacity of Deputy President for 4 years and President for 6. And over the course of those 10 years, I firmly have come to the view that the role of the Senate is not a talk shop, contrary to the belief of some, but it is an extremely useful institution. It may have been limited in its capacity, and perhaps this is the time, this is the opportunity for us to reform and adjust. But the removal of the upper chamber would represent, in my view, a travesty at this time in our existence in the republic we call our home, Barbados. And why do I say that? Over the 10 years, while we debated various topics, while we argued, vigorously represented, we also took the opportunity to have the views of persons who may not otherwise have had an opportunity to make a change in the legislation of their country, to have their voices heard by such a wide and diverse community. People say it's a talk shop. But ask yourselves, why is it that people still listen? Why is it that people still participate in online discussions and debates on things that are discussed and represented there? It is because there is value in the contributions, in the speeches made at the Senate table. In my estimation, however, this is the time for change. There is an imbalance in the structure of the Senate, in the numbers. I do not pretend to such an academic brain to sit and tell you X percentages or Y quotas need to be implemented. I cannot tell you those things. That is not my area of expertise. What I do know, however, is that in our country, there are those persons who, for various reasons, would never seek to go before the polls for elected politics. There are those who say, well, then they should not have a say in the way that our country is run. But having been there for 10 years, I can tell you why I disagree with that statement or that viewpoint. I disagree because persons who live with disabilities, persons who are older, the youth and others, many different groups within our community, for all the different reasons, are at different pathways in their lives, but they have a valuable contribution to make. When I sat in the Senate chamber, I received communications from people who may not feel that their cause would be taken up or represented by those in other spaces. They say, no, after you get my ex, you don't want to hear from me. But Carrie Ann, or the other woman, or the person who looks like me, who speaks like me, who comes from my area, they may be more interested in hearing from me. And therefore, that person can take forward their views and share them not only with the 21 persons or however many persons we have in the Senate chamber, but with all those persons who review, the persons whose job it is in the ministries to sit, to listen, to learn, to write, to draft. All of these people are impacted. How would it be if we have a chamber made up of all persons from one category, one strata of our society? The lower house does an excellent job. And some say we can only elect who come forward. I have my own views on that, but tonight is not the night for that. The point of the story is that the lower house is constructed by election process. Look at our chamber today, our Senate chamber. We have younger people. We have the academic. We have the non-academic. We have older. We have persons with disabilities. I will not go to the discussion about a youthful representation because I don't intend to stir up that one tonight. That is for others to do. But what we do have is a diverse representation. And that is why the Senate remains a useful chamber. That is my first point. Secondly, there's always a requirement for checks and balances. When we have a system that is led, guided, and guarded by only one chamber, it does not afford us the time to relook, revisit, or seriously update. There are no checks, there are no balances. There's no one to offer a view to say, hold on, stop. Perhaps this needs to be revisited again. Maybe this might not be the best way to go about this. Our upper chamber provides such a check, such an opportunity to revisit. Several times during my tenure in the Senate, I observed and participated in opportunities to change the course of a piece of legislation, to reject certain things, to point out certain fallacies, so that when the bill came back in the future, it could be amended and addressed differently. And therefore, that is the second reason why I believe our Senate provides a useful role. I said I do not have the brain to give you the quotas and the percentages. But if we take example from other countries, we can learn from them what works and what hasn't worked, what may work with a bit of tweaking or adjustment. In Africa, there are several countries who have adopted a quota system to fill their Senate chambers, to fill, in fact, the entire parliament structure. There are those who have gender quotas. There are others, Uganda, for example, who from their local government straight up to their federal government structure provide a place for persons with disabilities. They must have one. We do not have the need for tribal leaders here, as other countries may do, but we have other underrepresented groups within our country. I will not attempt to name them all because some might say, well, why didn't you remember these or that? But the point is, as we look around, there are many different groups. There are many different religions, different ideologies, different people, different thinking that would need an opportunity to change the course. I leave those few remarks and thoughts with you to generate discussion. Feel free to challenge me on any of them, because at the end of the day, we want what is best for Barbados. And in my humble estimation, I suggest that it is a bicameral system with both an upper and lower chamber. An upper chamber, redressed, reformed, yes, but we need both. Thank you.
So you will be hearing during the course of the evening the expressions unicameral and bicameral, and just to repeat that a unicameral legislature or unicameral parliament is a parliament that has one house, and a bicameral house, a bicameral parliament is a parliament which has two houses, such as Barbados, a lower house and an upper house. And the lower house, of course, is the place where the elected parliamentarians sit, and where you will also find and they're called the backbench, and the elected but appointed ministers, who are known as the front bench, also sit in the lower house. And the Senate has appointed members only. And Dr. Ocean Springer will now explain more about the government and politics from the theory and the policy level.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I also want to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to be part of this exercise tonight. And I want to say good night to one and all.
Speak into a microphone.
So in my presentation this evening, I'm going to focus on two key issues. And the first one is going to be relating to gender, and the second one is going to be relating to the constitutional role of Senate. Now, if we think about modern democracies, we can all agree that modern democracies place a central focus on their legislatures, right? And as the chair just mentioned, we have countries that have bicameral legislatures, and we have those that have unicameral legislatures. Now, the constitution within these legislatures varies between different countries, but one of the key concerns that we always hear in relation to countries that have adopted unicameral legislatures is that there are concerns in relation to inadequate representation of diverse interests within society. Now, even though we live in a very small society, we can all agree, as my panelist has just mentioned, that there are still diverse interests that would need representation within Parliament. And I therefore think that a bicameral Parliament is necessary because it ensures a more nuanced representation of society. Now, I'm particularly interested in the diversity issue in our legislature in relation to gender, and we would have different senates constituted in terms of how they structure their representation based on different criteria. So in some spaces, the criteria will be based on regions. So you would have persons sending maybe 2 representatives from each province or each region. In some spaces, you would have certain communities represented within Senate. So persons represented based on ethnicity, perhaps based on religion, based on language, etc. And then you can also have representation based on the diversity that part of what my fellow panelist was mentioning in terms of interest groups. So persons living with disabilities, youth, the elderly, etc. Right now, my interest lies here because we are always talking about diversity, but we never think about the cross-sectionality in diversity and related to the gender question. Right? Because if we think about gender inequality, it is one of the oldest forms of inequality. Right? And how do we take advantage of this opportunity that we have to address this oldest form of inequality, and how can we begin to contemplate of a design of our legislative or of our parliamentary system that can specifically and deliberately target an increase of representation of women within these spaces, right? And this is, we're not just saying this for saying this sake. This is against the background that there has been consistent underrepresentation of women in Parliament, both the upper house and the lower house. Now, if we look at conversations about inclusivity around the world over the past maybe couple of decades, there seems to be, a move towards more democratic forms of government, but on the other hand, in some spaces, there seems to be some regression. I'm not going to focus on those. But the issue of gender has gained traction, and persons are therefore very interested in how we can actually strategically, if you are looking at it from that perspective, how we can strategically include or enhance women's participation in politics, right? But even as we see the increase in the issue of gender inequality, statistics have actually shown that the number of women participating in politics, and statistics are usually constructed based on the lower house, the elected house. These statistics have shown that numbers are actually on the decline. They're actually on the decline or they are stagnating, right? So if we think of our current, if we think of our Senate, maybe it is going in the separate trajectory, because I think the current Senate has the largest number of females. I'm subject to correction, but we have 9 members out of the 21, which is about 42%. The previous Senate would have had about 8. I think the one previous to that would have had about 5. And I think the number continues to dip as we go back further, again, subject to correction. Right? But the Caribbean is not the only space. That is why I'm saying we should really take the issue of gender as an important issue, because the Caribbean is not the only space where we find an underrepresentation of women in politics. It is a worldwide phenomenon, right? But certain countries have taken steps and measures, and I will maybe speak a little bit about this, about what we can do. But if we look at data, if we were to use hard facts from the Interparliamentary Union, which is the body that collects statistics in relation to the global share of women represented within parliament, and again, they use mostly statistics from the lower house, the average is 26.5, right? And if we think about our realities in Barbados, I think that that average is actually what is reflected in our reality in Barbados right now. But the question is, we can ask ourselves, we don't even have to look at the phenomenon from a worldwide perspective. We can ask ourselves, why is this the case in Barbados? Because if we look at women's participation in politics, there are women who are activists, women who are very active. Women, I think, within political parties form majority of the membership. This is subject to correction. So there are questions that we have to ask ourselves about what are these bottlenecks that women face in relation to representation in these key spaces, such as Senate and the lower house, because it seems to be a kind of closed shop. But when we think about democracy, one of the key issues, again, is representation, right? And representation has evolved over time to include different groups yes, but traditionally women have been restricted to playing either very private roles or playing supportive roles. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with those roles, but women aspire for more. It cannot be that women are always playing supportive and these very private roles, right? And if we continue along the trajectory that we have seen countries in the Caribbean and around the world taking, then for those women who aspire to serve, as my fellow panelist has just said, the reality is not very encouraging for them, right? So in what ways, again, do we make a conscious choice to enhance spaces or to enhance capacity, maybe, for women to participate in these spaces? Now, even though we can see an increase in the numbers of women in Senate over the last two election cycles, this is still left to the disposition of the Prime Minister, to the disposition of the President, to the disposition of the Leader of Opposition. And my opinion is that we should be thinking about a critical mass that we would want to see in Senate. And I think that Senate is much easier for us to try to make workable in relation to this issue of gender equality. So if we're thinking of a critical mass, and critical mass, if we look statistically, and if we're looking at gender quotas, what has been the average gender quotas that have been adopted in different countries? Critical mass is usually 30%. Right? So despite gender inequality being an issue that has gone on for a very long period of time, critical mass is still set at 30%. Right? Now, in our Senate right now, we are at 42%, and I would like us to think above the 30%, because I don't think there is a dearth of women who are experienced enough and who are capable to serve in Barbados, right? Because if we do not think about the issues of critical mass, it means that in this election cycle, we might have 40%, but in the next election cycle, depending on who wins and depending on the inclination of the leader who is, the PM or the president, again, the number might dip to 3 or 2 or 4, or it might increase too, but we're leaving it to chance, right? So that is why I'm saying that how do we consciously put things in place so that we do not rely, one, on the inclinations of leaders, and two, on structures that are not very stable in creating spaces that are encouraging for women that want to serve. And if we look at gender quotas, I think, I may be wrong, but I think over 132 countries have gender quotas within their political systems. And this is done at different levels, similar to what my panelist has just mentioned. Right? But I think that this exercise, again, because this is the first time that we're really getting an opportunity to participate in how we are going to be governed, how we would like to be governed, how we would like our political systems to look like. I think this is an important window of opportunity for us to place this issue high up on the agenda. And like I said before, I think it is easier to adopt in Senate than it is in the lower house, depending on how we choose to constitute Senate. Now, it is one thing to speak about gender inequality and women's participation in politics, but we know that it is an issue that does not exist in a vacuum, right? So when we're speaking about gender inequality in politics, we have to think about political culture. Right? And in what ways we all understand that political culture is not something that we can say can shift in one election cycle or in 2 election cycles, right? And political culture always lags. So you legislate, and then political culture, sometimes there's a lag, and the lag sometimes takes quite a while. So do we leave things to chance, or do we say, let's patiently wait until the population catches up, or do we legislate and then actively bring people along, right? So when we're speaking about political culture, obviously we're speaking about people's perceptions, people's beliefs about who should participate and who perhaps should represent them in politics. And traditionally, in Barbados, as it has been in different other spaces, it is still very male-centric, right? And this is instructive because we're speaking in this space where we have our first female prime minister, where we currently have a female DPM, where we have a female president. But we have to remember that the optics of leadership do not directly translate to persons' perceptions and persons' beliefs of who they think should represent them. And that is why I think we continue to have that underrepresentation. So the optics of it might seem encouraging, and that is well and good. But again, how do we systematically, consciously put things in place that allows us to maybe provide some kind of balance in our political landscape? In terms of recommendations, very quickly, I can think of maybe development and implementation of public education campaigns to deal with that political culture aspect. So we be very targeted in terms, and we be very specific in terms of what we want our goal to be. So if you want our goal to be to shift political cultures, then we are very targeted in how we reach people and the messaging that we communicate to persons. The second one could be that the persons who are in the space already, some of them are on the panel with me right now, engage communities and let people know maybe sometimes what are the challenges that they face, and just speak to persons within communities. And within communities, we're speaking to both, you understand, we're speaking to everyone. So we're speaking to males and females, right? And this ties into this exercise that we have this evening, because I'm not sure that an all-female cast that we have today is a very useful way of bringing some balance to this conversation. Because you've had maybe several male casts and you've taken the extreme route, and now you have a female cast. So I think that it would be more useful if diversity is reflected in conversations and in the outreach activities that we have, and we want these outreach efforts to be consistent and inclusive of males as well. And then the last one is perhaps encourage institutions, and not just educational institutions, other institutions as well, to incorporate topics related to gender, gender stereotyping and women's participation in politics and in other areas as well, as part of trying to build maybe confidence in girls that might want to be more active, to try to reach out to those who aspire to serve, to give public service, and to try to deal with that political culture aspect. And we're doing all this because, again, there is a recognition that there's a gender gap. right? And there's a gap to be filled. And then I will just move on quickly to the constitutional role of Senate. Now, when I'm thinking of the constitutional role of Senate, I'm thinking about it in terms of composition and purpose, right? So as it stands now, we heard that we have 21 members, 12 are appointed by the President on advice of the PM, 7 independent members appointed by the President at her sole discretion, and 2 on advice of the opposition. Now, given this composition, we can deduce certain things about what was the intended role of Senate in our space, right? And the intended role of Senate, the deduction is that Senate was intended to provide an additional forum to scrutinize legislation, essentially, right? But you're scrutinizing legislation in a space that is less confrontational than what we are used to in the lower house, right? So in what ways already we are thinking about in what ways Senate was meant to be complementary to. Now, do we want to maintain that complementarity, or do we want to take a different route? So if we look at, if we deduce this intention, the intention was therefore not necessarily to always challenge the policies or decisions, but to perhaps provide a sober second thought, so that decisions are not made hastily, so that, the technical aspects of the law are covered, and maybe so that ill-considered decisions are not made. And I think to that extent, Senate has been actually doing or performing its role. Now, this is a function of Westminster, the Westminster model, right? The way that it is structured, it can be quite efficient, right? And if we're saying that structure or efficiency hinges on structure, then we want to ask ourselves, if we want to move in a different direction, how are we going to affect efficiency? Because if you're speaking about efficiency, you're speaking about the ability of government to respond to public demands, for example, and to be able to meet their goals, right? And another intention of Senate was to provide additional checks and balances, as my colleague has said, because, again, you don't want a single chamber to have unlimited control of legislative power. And historically, there have been situations where legislation has not passed in the upper house, but I think by and large, voting is usually consistent with party affiliation, especially. This might be subject to correction, but I think I might be right on this. Right? Now, given this composition of Senate and given this intention of Senate, can we safely say that a body that is not independent from a government cannot effectively act as a check on government? All right? What was the intention? The intention was to be complementary to. The intention was to provide public scrutiny to. But is it okay to leave things to chance, or do we want to enhance maybe non-partisanship within this space? Now, I think that there are advantages to bicameralism, and I think that the second chamber should be maintained. But I think some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves are, in what ways, as I've mentioned already, do we want the chamber to be complementary to the lower house? And to what extent do we want it to be independent and less partisan, perhaps, right? Because at the same time, we don't want to end, as I mentioned before, we don't want to create problems for ourselves where we end up having deadlock that we see under the presidential system, which makes it very difficult to govern. If we want to take this conversation a little further, and this is just to play devil's advocate maybe, we can think of how independent senators are nominated, right? Should there be an independent nomination committee, maybe, with authority to nominate candidates that will scrutinize any proposed nominees, or should we continue to rely on the tradition that we have now, where the president nominates persons within certain fields, right? And if you're speaking about Senate allowing for representation of diverse interests, will an independent nominations commission widen the net in terms of that diversity that we want to get in Senate? And then my final point, it just ties to what I've just said so far. So apart from the constitutional requirements that we have about who can be a senator, which is in our constitution, which is citizenship, residency, and age, should we think about, because I know it happens, but I think it happens traditionally. I'm not sure if there's anything concrete in terms of criteria of who can serve in Senate. Because otherwise, we also have to think about the reality that Senate then becomes, or Senate then is used by political parties as, a form of patronage or clientelism, right? And how do we deal with that particular issue? And I just want to conclude here by saying that I think one of the more attractive features of the Westminster model is that is just what it is. It is a model. It is not rigid. It allows for flexibility, so we can tinker, we can make it workable, and as we mature in our political development, these are some of the issues that I think that we can think about and modify it based on our legal, political, sociocultural, historical environments. And then just finish off with a little theory. When we think about John Stuart Mill and when we think about Montesquieu, those who are theorizing about the forms of government, in their theorizing, we have to remind ourselves that they were not thinking about the best form of government, because I don't think there is a best form of government, right? You're thinking about the system that discourages the worst, right? So what is it that works for you, and in what ways can we adopt what works for us moving forward? And I think on this note, I'll end my presentation.
I should like to thank Dr. Oceang Springer for her provocative ending in particular. The Westminster model is just that, a model. So what should the Barbados model be? You tell us. I want to recognize in the audience this evening the Honorable Peter Phillips, the Member of Parliament for St. Lucie, and to welcome the 200 people whom we have online so far. And with that, we go to the right side of the table to Ms. Verbrathwaite, attorney at law.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sir Richard, Sir Roy, other members of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, other panelists.
Hold a second, just I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Brathwaite. To the streaming team, apparently there is a difficulty on one of the YouTube channels. We're not being heard or seen. If we could have some technical checks, please. That is the information we're getting.
I see you have a green light, but I don't have one.
Yes, for just a minute.
Can you hear me well? Yes, yes. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all. Let me first thank you, members of the Commission, for your invitation to join you this evening and to present some very brief remarks. I want to start by making a suggestion that I think everybody here and online has heard already, which is this: if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Now, we've heard Sir Richard in his opening remarks mention that the Barbados parliamentary system was in place since 1639. With specific focus on the Senate, we also heard that it started with 8 members and through the years increased, where in 1964, the members of the Senate were increased to 21, and that's the number that still obtains today. I think in determining what the role and function of the Senate is, and in answering the question whether it's an outdated talk shop or useful institution, we first need to examine its place in Barbados's constitutional arrangement. Now, we then need to determine whether it's necessary or desirable, or both. Because even if it's not necessary, you might still need to consider whether it's desirable in our Barbados situation. Now, I think we'll all agree that a body politic must be managed, otherwise it will descend into disarray and disorder, and ultimately social and political decay will result and could possibly lead to a failed state. But we have to understand also that whatever form of government is chosen, that government must govern. We also need to focus on the fact that good governance requires certainty, order, and the sustainability of both. So that in looking at the present arrangement, even if it might be found that it is not perfect, there's a well-established universal governance principle which states that governance just needs to be good enough, and that we should not make perfect the enemy of good. So that if it works, there is no need to tinker, to strive for perfection without having first identified whether the change is necessary, and if not necessary, certainly desirable. So we need first of all to identify what mischief might exist that needs to be addressed and fixed. Now, there have been several ideas advanced, such as more representation on a proportional basis, but then we ask ourselves, representation of what? Now, I make connection with Sir Richard's opening remarks, where he states when he was speaking to the 10% suggestion, that it might be possible that you might have all sorts of splinter groups arising just to get to the 10% threshold. Now, in that situation, it could lead to to uncertainty and certainly disorder. So that when I say you must check first what it is you are trying to fix, and then in putting ideas forward, you must also consider the workability of those ideas. So let's look at proportional representation for a while. To determine the proportions, you must first establish who are you seeking to represent by those proportions. So at the moment, the Senate, speaking specifically of the Senate, is an appointed chamber. And if you look at the composition of the Senate, it is not by accident that it is constituted in the way it is. 21 government senators, 7 independent senators appointed by the Governor General, and, well, all senators are appointed by the Governor General, but you catch my drift. 7 representing the government's interests, 7 representing other interests which the Governor General deems appropriate, which we call independent senators, and then 7 senators who are representative of the opposition. Now, once all members are in their seats in any session and voting strictly along the lines that they were appointed to serve, the government will always hold the balance of power. And I want to suggest that it is foolhardy for any government to seek to establish any system which, if you maintain a bicameral arrangement, any system which will seek to frustrate, undermine, or nullify the government's programs. So when you speak of proportional representation, the devil is in the detail. Now, I've also heard an idea advanced, whether the Senate should be elected. We have to determine how that would fit into our constitutional and governance arrangement. Should the Senate have veto power over the elected officials in the other house? Should the Senate be discarded altogether, leading to a unicameral parliament, a parliament which consists only of one house? And if it is discarded, should it be replaced? Replaced with what? I want to suggest that, having not heard any persuasive argument why the current arrangement should be changed, that the Senate should remain, but that adjustments might be made to its structure, to its makeup, to its role. Should it be elected or appointed or blended approach? I want also to say to you that an elected Senate opens the government up to the same type of situation that I mentioned earlier, which is that its interests as an elected government, elected lower house, might be frustrated in the upper house because you have no idea who will be elected to the upper house. And I think it would make a nonsense of government, actually. We actually see that situation obtaining, from my understanding, of the congressional arrangements in the United States, where both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, are elected. And I think just from observing from afar, many of us have witnessed how the lower house efforts to introduce legislation have been stymied in the upper house, where they both are not aligned with the same political interests. So that you have a Republican lower house, a Democratic upper house, or vice versa, and it has appeared on several occasions, never the twain shall meet. I want to also touch briefly on the international idea, which is the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. That is a body, an intergovernmental organization that works to support and strengthen democratic institutions and processes worldwide. And its mission is to promote and advance democracy the world over. Its stated vision is a world in which democratic processes, actors, and institutions are inclusive and accountable, and they deliver sustainable development to all. They focus on three main impact areas: electoral processes, constitutional building processes, and political participation and representation. International IDEA was founded in 1995. It is an official United States observer, headquartered in Stockholm, Sweden, with regional offices in Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia and the Pacific, and Africa and West Asia. Of note, is that not only is Barbados a member, but it was a founding member of International IDEA. And in fact, from my research, Barbados was the only Caribbean state listed as a founding member. And International IDEA speaks to, among other things, it asks the question, is a second chamber necessary or desirable? If it is either necessary or desirable or both, how should it be designed? What are its powers and what should its functions be? And they state, and I agree with, that the historical, political, social, and economic context must be examined for each country because no one size would fit all. So that it's important to analyze the needs and the circumstances of the country in question. How diverse are its people? Are there any underrepresented national minorities? What is its territorial structure? Is it centralized or decentralized? Is it federal or unitary? What were the shortcomings of the former constitutional arrangement? And remember, I mentioned earlier that we must determine what the mischief is that must be fixed. And my opening statement, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. So International IDEA is suggesting that one of the things you need to look at when determining whether there needs to be change, and if so, what type of change, that you need to examine what were the shortcomings of the current arrangement and what improvements are necessary. Is there a need to provide additional checks and balances? Is there a need to improve the technical quality of the legislation, to broaden political participation of particular groups? And if you do determine that participation of particular groups must be broadened and enhanced, my earlier question, how will these groups be identified? So you might have diverse interests in the society, and we here in Barbados, if you pay close attention to public utterances in other places, there are several ideas that are put forward, and they all contend, and long may it remain that way in a democracy. But once you determine that an upper house is necessary, then you have to determine its purposes, its composition, and its powers. What power should it have? So International IDEA have suggested that there are broadly 4 categories of second chambers in a bicameral arrangement. So there are chambers which they're called chambers of review and reflection. And the main focus of those is to improve the quality of legislation and to provide a forum in which appointed experts and what you might call elder statespersons can contribute to the debate of technical details of the legislation. And they note, in a calm and informed manner, without challenging the primacy of the lower chamber in terms of policy making. And that chamber would have limited powers, powers of amendment or delay, and may veto legislation in a limited way. Now, we don't use the word veto here in Barbados, but we speak of the Senate voting down legislation or not supporting the legislation. So that first type of chamber of review and reflection, an appointed chamber, is very similar to what currently obtains in Barbados. Then there's another type of chamber, upper chamber, which is intended to provide territorial representation and interests. We don't have that type of situation in Barbados where, for example, you might have original inhabitants and so on, people in far out areas, people who are not usually included in the social and economic and political processes. We are a small island, and we have been all-inclusive. There might be some fights along the way, but structurally, we are all-inclusive. There's a third type of chamber, which is called the Chamber of Socio-Cultural Representation, and that exists to provide a broader range of representation. Can be achieved by including minority communities, or giving a voice to certain social, economic, and cultural interests. These powers may be advisory. This chamber would also have limited veto powers, and they're advisory, especially over laws that particularly concern the various interest groups. And the fourth type of secondary chamber or upper chamber in the bicameral arrangement is what international idea refers to as chambers that are based on the principle of democratic contestation. And these chambers provide a check on the incumbents of the other house, which we call the lower house. And the persons who occupy this chamber are chosen by direct election and typically have wide veto powers. So the arrangement in the United States comes to mind in that instance. But it must also be understood that the chambers are not mutually exclusive. And so, in reality, they may play two or more complementary roles. I'd like to suggest that what we currently have in Barbados and what might be enhanced are two of those chambers, numbers 1 and 3, where a chamber of reflection and review with appointed experts and elder statespersons. And we've seen that. That's what currently obtains. And the blend also with the socio-cultural representation, where the president has the power to appoint persons who represent various interest groups in the country. Now, it could be said that those interest groups might be broadened. We might have, for example, more women, as has been mentioned before. We might have persons who represent the LGBTQ community. We might have environmentalists. We might have atheists, the elderly, the youth. But remember also that several of those interests might be found in one and the same person. So that you might have a female young person who is an environmentalist, who is a member of the LGBTQ community, and who is an atheist. So it is not necessarily counting the number of bodies in seats, but the interests which the president identifies as being necessary. And there might be others. But at the end of the day, remember, however the second chamber is constituted, and I haven't heard any member of the panel tonight state that they disagree with the present constitutional arrangement where there is an upper house. I certainly agree with it. However it's constituted, remember, it must never, in my view, be constituted so that the government's program is frustrated or undermined. Now, As I mentioned before, the current structure is instructive, so that even if it is felt that you should increase the number of persons in the Senate to increase maybe opposition voices or the voices of other interest groups, then my respectful suggestion is that the members on the government side must also be increased, so that once the president of the Senate is sitting in the president's chair and therefore has no voice or vote except in a very particular circumstance to break a tie, so the government loses that one government senator. When the House then goes into committee and the president leaves the chair and the deputy president takes the chair in committee, then what obtains in the current 21-member arrangement is that provided that all members are present, the governing party in committee has one vote more than the total of the others combined. When not in committee, the governing party has 2 votes more than the others combined. And that is instructive. The founding fathers found it necessary, and I think it makes for very good common sense, that you cannot and should not frustrate the will of an elected government in a parliamentary democracy which was elected in a free and fair election. Otherwise, what could result is chaos and confusion and uncertainty and disorder. So that I want to suggest that the number 21 in the Senate is not magic. It can be increased or it can be decreased. But whatever number obtains, that balance between total number of government senators and total number of senators between the opposition and the independent senators must always result in a balance of power in favor of the government. Now, there's a situation where the government must reach across the aisle, as they say in America, and make friends and influence others on the other side. And that is where there is a proposed amendment to the Constitution, where it is necessary to have a 2/3 majority of the Senate. And in its current arrangement, the 2/3 majority, they need others on the other side. So they need to court friends and influence them to get particularly if all members on the government side are not present. So that is another fetter which reduces the government's power, because all members of the government side must be in place at one and the same time. So I want to suggest also that if it is done otherwise, given that the Senate is considered necessary, in my humble opinion, the debates are out of the public glare to a large extent and allows for sober reflection. There is no, as it were, pressure to grandstand or to make yourself larger than life for your constituents, because there are none. So there's an opportunity for sober reflection in the upper chamber. If that is not the case, I want to suggest that our country is too small, too young, not nominally but in real terms, too inexperienced, and too fragile politically and economically to risk derailment, frustration, and undermining of government programs. So that whatever interests are considered to be included, and we can make them as broad as possible, it is necessary to ensure that the totality on the different sides do not influence the balance of power in the government's favor in the Senate. Now, there's some ways, and I would just want to make this closing comment, just by way of suggestion. There's also some ways I'd suggest that these other interests can be accommodated in our constitutional arrangements, so that the president not only can expand the interests traditionally represented, but you might consider including committees, either in the House or in the Senate, or both. You might call them citizens' assemblies, councils of elders, however they're styled, which are present in the chamber, one or either or both, representing and speaking to various interests, because let's face it, in a first past the post system, which I want to suggest is still the best in my view, first of all, you don't know what you're going to get once all the votes are counted. And then secondly, there might be gaps in interests, gaps in resources, gaps in skills that should be represented in the lower house. So that you might consider a situation where these committees of statesmen or stateswomen representing wider interests are established. Those committees of whatever number could sit, observe the debate, and make useful contributions, however, having only voice but not vote. So they might even influence the debate, where you find, for example, that in the Senate, because of the government balance of power, some people have termed it a talk shop, because, as they say, whatever the government sends up usually goes, and that's the case, except once all members are in their seats, that's the case, except in the where there's a constitutional amendment. We've seen only recently, in the last few years, that a proposed constitutional amendment did not carry in the House. In the Senate, did not carry in the Senate because the 2/3 representation was not present. So that is a break that is established there by the founding fathers. But back to my suggestion of these committees of interest, committees of elders, however you might term them, they might sit in the House or in the Senate to lend expansion and clarification and the wisdom of experience and learning and skills to enhance the debate. They might even influence some votes, but at the end of the day, voice must not translate to vote, because, and I'll end here where I started, governments must govern, and there must be order and certainty and sustainability of both. I'm available for any questions, and I thank you for listening.
Very well, yeah.
You've heard from our panel. You may ask our panel questions. I'm checking with our technical team to see if there are questions or comments online that the panel needs to address. In the meanwhile, I know that there was at least one person in the room who wanted to ask questions or make observations. I invite that person to go to the microphone now, please. The technician is getting it ready for anybody who wants to speak. I'm also asking the commissioners if they would wish to engage our panelists on any issue. I was very attracted myself to this idea of a committee, and immediately a committee of elders, and immediately I saw in my mind a committee of national elders drawn from various sectors.
Well, let's say, Chair, that I mentioned the word elders because that's usually the word that's bandied about. But
you
I
could
think
call
that-
them statespersons.
Right, so let's
you
take
could-
back the word elders because
No, I
they
like
could be
elders. I like elders.
all-inclusive, young, the youth. Huh?
You're ready to speak? Oh, yeah. So a national committee of,
Or the National Committee.
Good
the
night.
microphone, you'll be assisted?
Yes, I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Good night to the panel.
I think the mic is still a little too high for her. Please
I'm good
speak.
here? I'm
Yes,
good here.
thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you.
Great.
First, I want to commend the panel and the organization for such a, what should I say? I'm lost for words now. I'm at the mic, and I'm not usually lost for words. But
Find your name, or tell us your name before.
Oh, my name, I'm sorry, my name is Saitome Orwell. Right, but
Thank you.
I am so impressed that, you know, as a small society, ours could come up with such an idea as this to involve the ordinary man into the reform of the Constitution, the parliamentary group. I am very, very, very impressed. And I would agree with everyone that spoke that the upper house should remain. Because I always used to think of, if a government make a decision in the lower house, how a parliament, how a senate could shoot it down? I don't understand. I thought if it's made, it's made. But having heard so much before in all the forums, and now hearing this one, I am really impressed, and I see the need for the Senate. As former Senator Brathwaite said, we need some additional force like the elderly and the youth, and because I'm always impressed with the youth. I'm always impressed with any contribution the youth have to make, especially if it is taking the country forward. So I'm in agreement that we should involve those groups, right? But my only concern, and if I see any change in the reform of the parliamentary group, is that I always wonder, why do you have to pay a clergy to pray? Why do you need? Why do you need a clergy just to pray? Is there any other function that the clergy does apart from praying for the beginning of Senate? I could take my answer no.
Sorry, was there a question?
Yes,
we didn't hear it.
No, I asked, my question is...
Oh, you really wanted us to answer why a chaplain was needed?
Not, yes, what is he paid just to pray? If there's any other function that he does in the Senate, apart from just starting off with prayer. I need an answer.
So, I think that God would want his work rewarded.
But do it have to be rewarded? But because I attend other organizations, and you know there are people among you that have various different religious beliefs. And can anybody from the table pray? Do it have to be a special person to pray?
There is no rule that says that it has to be a trained or qualified priest.
Or even paid?
That's the thing.
I don't think so. You know, we've been having this conversation about the remuneration of parliamentarians, of senators, and so on. And the person who comes to the chamber every week to give prayers and blessings as we conduct our business. If you think of our national anthem, it is grounded in God, it is grounded in prayer, and therefore to give them some small recompense is a recognition of the fact that we have always had trained priests, that they are giving of their time. It means that they are spending time away from their parishioners and are actually in the chamber while we're working and at the start. And I think it is merely a recognition that what they are doing has value, and we appreciate it. Everybody else who comes and renders some kind of work at the Parliament is paid, except the senators, who receive a stipend and not a salary. And it is a very small stipend. It is a very small stipend. I think senators make $1,500 a month.
Oh, okay.
And that is for meeting for a full day every week. It includes the fact that to debate, you have to prepare for the debate. You have to be there all day. And if, for instance, you are a person who is paid by seeing patients, for instance, if you are a doctor who sees patients, if you are not there, if you are not in your office, if you are in the Senate the whole day, you can't earn. You're actually losing money.
Right.
On the day that you have to spend preparing, you're also losing money. So the stipend really merely covers gas in your car.
Well, while I appreciate all that you said, Senator Thompson, I didn't have any quarrel with a senator being paid, or even a stipend, if you call it that. But I am still
I
of the
was
view.
hoping you would recommend a raise, but go ahead.
But other than to say you should have more. But having said that, remember, I'm a God-fearing person, and I believe in God, and I believe that nothing, but I still don't feel that that should be the only function of the clergy. If that is all he is doing, then you don't necessarily, in the reform, need a clergy. Anybody with a religious background or belief can say the prayer at Senate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your view, Ms. Worrell. We note it, and we will discuss it with the other recommendations and ideas. I want, if I may, to put two questions to our panel, one to Dr. Oshieng Springer, and it is to take her up on this matter of quotas for women in the lower and the upper chamber, and I want to ask her how she thinks...
In the upper. In the upper.
In the upper? In the upper chamber, how she thinks this would work. And I want her to share with us some of the countries across the globe that actually use quota systems. That's a question to Dr. Oshieng Springer. And to former President, Ms. Carrie-Ann Eiffel, I would want to ask her, she spoke about skill sets and being a system of check and balance on the lower house and broadening the perspectives and the depth of the debate. And I wanted to ask her, therefore, what interest groups or skill sets does she think should be represented in the Senate? I start with Ms. Eiffel.
Thank you very much. In my humble opinion, like I said, we have, former Senator Brathwaite articulated several of them. We have skill sets of persons from Barbados. We are embarking on broadening our work in the blue and green economies. The opportunity to have persons from that background in the upper chamber, that's one skill set that we should have. We should also have persons who are child's rights advocates, workers in the field for our children. The educational field is definitely one. Teachers. Economic backgrounds. The interest groups that I think should be there are, as I've said before, from a diverse grouping. Religious backgrounds, non-religious, of course, people who are from the LGBTQ community, people who are from the Christian community, persons who are living with disabilities, of course, the elderly, most certainly the youth. Now, I want to expand a bit further on something that, as our moderator would say, attracted me. And that is the notion of citizens' assemblies or subcommittees or whatever we call them as part of the discussion. I think that would help to broaden it. But how we get these various interest groups into the Senate is a different question. Should they all be appointed? I'm not so attracted to everyone being appointed, but I certainly do agree that government's work shouldn't be frustrated. They should be able to work. They can work a little harder to court the people across the way, maybe. But be that as it may, we do need the work of the country to go forward and not to be held up just because it can be. So that is my view when it comes to the skill sets and the representations within the Senate.
Right. All right, thanks for your question. When I think about countries that have adopted gender quotas, I think about some of the countries within the European Union. So I think Germany is one, Spain is another, Italy is another. We can think of Norway, so those are Western countries. If we want to think about smaller countries in the global south that might be somewhat similar to our size, even though it's a little larger, we can think about countries like Rwanda, even though their history is a little different. But it has been a country that has adopted gender quotas. But I think in all the common denominator in all these spaces is whether you're a developed country or whether you're a country not in the developed space, we have to deliberately create opportunities for women to participate in political parties. So depending on where you want your critical mass to be, and traditionally, based on the IPU, it has been maintained at 30, but some other countries have gone higher than that. So in this instance, I am recommending, or I want us to consider maybe legislating quotas within Senate, which is a little easier to me, and I think that we can maintain the threshold that we've arrived at so far at 40%, right? And it's a little easier to me than the lower house, because when we're thinking about the lower house, there are layers that we have to take into consideration. So we have to take into consideration the nomination process, for example. We have to take into consideration all the other aspects that tie into the political process before you actually get to the elections. While in Senate, depending on how we choose to constitute it, it might be a little easier to deliberately mandate quotas within that space. Right?
So I'm going to share with you now, we have over 200 people online. When last I asked for a check, so we are heading toward our weekly number of 300. I'm going to throw out to the panel some of the questions and comments that are made or have been made online. There is no discrimination against women in Barbados. What are you all talking about? What protection can we get? And I'm not going to read this verbatim, but to tell you what the question was, and you will discern of whom they speak. What protection can we get to stop a certain person who is a former president of one of our neighbors from destroying our democracy? The only thing I see that needs changing is the number of seats in Parliament. 30 is an even number. If both parties were to get 15 seats, who would make the government? Extend voting to more than one day. Those are the comments online that have been picked up. I don't think there are specific questions, but just to tell the panel what the responses to them have been so far. And before I move to a question for Ms. Brathwaite, we are going to hear from Commissioner Dr. William Chandler.
Thank you, Chair. Good night, everyone, and thank you to the panel for coming. I really appreciate it. It was actually extremely informative, and it was good to hear a little math on the numbers in the Senate in terms of conversations about the numbers in the House to come. I also want to give a special thank you to Mrs. Brathwaite for being here, the former Senator Eiffel, and Dr. Ocean Springer, who was my tutorial leader when I was an undergraduate student. And I, for some reason, went to every tutorial, even though I only had to go to one. And I used to see her, walk to classes with her, etc. So I'm really appreciative of her being here. My question to the panel is this. Well, first of all, we have one presentation, one submission from someone online who said that we should scrap the Senate completely and just have a unicameral parliament. And I know some panelists have said that we don't need to get rid of the Senate. But if we did get rid of the Senate, what would the parliament function like in your opinion? The next question is, should ministers be allowed to arise from the Senate? And the third question is there anyone on the panel who is specifically in favor of quotas for a particular interest? And if so, what interest is that?
Dr. Chandler, could you repeat the questions slowly, please, so
Sorry.
that the panel can hear them
Sorry.
and therefore can answer?
So the first one is,
But you told us you were very slow when you were telling us about your admiration for Dr. Springer. So
so the first question is from someone who actually wrote into us saying that you should scrap the Senate completely because it is a rubber stamp. Now, most people on the panel have said that the Senate is not a rubber stamp. But if the Senate were to be scrapped, what do you envisage the Parliament to look like in terms of its function? How would it actually work? Would there be more committees? How would the House of Assembly work? And what would the checks and balances be? Because you would still need to have checks and balances. The second question is whether you should have ministers arising from the Senate. And if you did not have ministers arising from the Senate, what then would be the mechanism for appointment of ministers where you may not have ministers, members of the House Assembly who could qualify for the ministry that you want? And the third question is, I haven't heard explicitly any of the panelists say that they are in favor of a quota for a particular interest. If you are in favor of a quota for a particular interest, then why are you in favor of it and what interest would that be? And if you're not in favor of a quota, then why are you not in favor?
Ms. Brathwaite, please.
So I think I'll attempt to answer your first question, which was if you scrap the Senate, what would result? Well, I don't know why you would scrap the Senate, having not identified a reason for doing so, and a valid reason, not just because you think it's a talk shop or you don't like paying the priest up there to pray, or, right? But, so as a purely academic exercise, because I'm not advocating that we scrap the Senate, and I haven't heard any reason advanced as to why it should be scrapped. But if you were to ask me, as a purely academic exercise, if the Senate were to be scrapped, what would obtain? Well, I imagine that in the present arrangement, where you have a House of Assembly and a Senate, and then legislation going to the President to be proclaimed, I would imagine that legislation would go directly from the House of Assembly to the President if you were to cut out that middle layer. You would lose the benefit of, as we mentioned earlier, as a second pair of eyes, a sober review in a more in an environment that lends itself to reflection, away from the hustle and bustle and the electoral requirements of the lower house. So you lose that, and you lose another set of skill sets. You lose interests that are represented in the Senate that are not necessarily represented in the House. And those are the things that that immediately come to mind. And I think that the things that you would lose, are important to maintain. Because let's face it, in the lower house, in the current situation, there's no question of interests being represented interests might be represented, but that is not usually the main focus. Certainly, it's not legislated, so there is no legal requirement for any particular interest to be represented in the lower house. And then, because you have a first past the post system, even if a party or a group of persons set out to have various interests represented on their slate of candidates and presented to the electorate, there is no certainty which of those interests would be returned by the electorate. So there's no structure there for the representation of particular interests which obtains in the House, which obtains in the Senate.
Are the other panelists minded to field the questions of Dr. Chandler?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Chandler, for your question. It's good to call you Dr. Chandler. But in relation to your first question, we have countries that have unicameral legislatures, right? And what has happened in these countries that have unicameral legislatures, it means, therefore, that you have to enhance the role of their select committees or whatever committees that they choose to have, so that these committees will be the ones to play the role of checks and balances within that space. Because at the end of the day, you still need that oversight function within the legislature. Now, the way in which these committees are constituted is contestable, but this is what happens in different other spaces, and I think that we would consider going down that direction, because I don't think we want to remove the oversight function from our legislature. In terms of how I think the legislature might look like, I think then the direction that we might want to consider is to have a combination of elected members and some that are appointed within that one house, right? So a few appointed members and majority elected members. So these can also help to provide that oversight function, which I don't recommend, by the way, but some spaces have done this. Your second question was?
Ministers.
Or do I think ministers should come from Senate? I think in general, if we look at Barbadian society, and if you look at how Senate is composed, there are persons within Senate that have certain expertise, right, that you do not necessarily find in the lower house, right? Because elective politics is very partisan, and sometimes the person that run for politics might not necessarily have the expertise that might be needed within cabinet, right? So if you have a space such as Senate that you can pull from, I don't see anything wrong with pulling someone from Senate to serve within cabinet. If they're bringing a particular perspective, they're adding, knowledge and a certain level of expertise to a particular area that you might want them to serve in.
I too would like to add my voice on that question, the second question. And that is to say, why wouldn't you want to have ministers arising out of the Senate? As we said, the Senate represents an opportunity to bring in other interest groups. And we want the best. We want the most informed. We want a cabinet comprising people that understand and can tackle the complex issues. If we have a parliament that is elected and does not have all the skills required at that time, why should we not be able to bring forward someone from the Senate to sit at that to have that opportunity to direct and guide and to really make that level of input? Because remember, ministers don't only serve in a cabinet meeting, they run ministries. They sit as parliamentary secretaries. They perform functions outside of Parliament at the ministerial level that helps to guide our country forward. So I can see no mischief. If you want to suggest that there might be a quota on ministers taken from the Senate, well, that's a different discussion altogether. And I'm not saying that that's my suggestion either. I'm just saying that there may be other questions that can arise, but I don't see the need. I honestly cannot see any not in our country. I don't see the value of removing the Senate chamber. As I said before, perhaps reconstructing the way in which it is put together, that is something that should be discussed and considered. But getting rid of it altogether to bring in a wholly untried system at this stage, I don't see how our country could benefit from a completely new, totally alternative, upside down. By the time you get that sorted out, then what?
Thank you very much. I want to say a special good evening to the members of the Constitutional Reform Commission who are actually following us online. So when you see me on the phone, I'm taking comments from, our technical team. They're telling me what's happening, and it isn't that I am at all distracted, so just explaining. Are there any other questions or comments in the room? We have a number of sitting parliamentarians. We have one senator at least.
Yes, Chair.
And Dr. Chandler returns to the microphone, and we're happy to have him. Yes, sir.
Yes, Chair. I noticed that no one took up my question on the quota, right? That's okay if you don't want to answer the
No,
quota
I think
question.
they just forgot.
But I also want to note something and then ask an opinion on it. So the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association notes in a 2021 survey that Barbados' senators are the lowest paid in the entire Commonwealth, with $1,500 stipend a month.
Can you repeat that, please?
I will repeat it, yes, Chair. The Commonwealth Parliamentary Association notes in a 2021 survey that Barbados' senators are the lowest paid in the entire Commonwealth, with $1,500 Barbadian per month, or $1,500 per month. In the panel's opinion, is this adequate for these checks and balance mechanisms that the Senate is supposed to perform? And if it isn't adequate, I won't ask you what the compensation should be, but can you give me an idea about what level of compensation would be adequate for someone who's supposed to be checking the government?
Dr. Chandler, I will answer your question by starting saying you are not catching me out on that one. What I will say, though, is no, it is not adequate. It is not adequate because, and the Senate, and one of the other things I should have said is I think one of the other things, when you bring in people, you also need to provide them with the tools and resources. And I believe that our Senate is under-resourced. We need more research, we need research support for senators. We need other training systems and mechanisms. Everybody does not have the same background that comes to the Senate. And if we are bringing people from diverse backgrounds and expecting them to perform, we also need to give them those resources. And among those resources is compensation commensurate, or in other language, the laborer is worthy of his hire. If you expect people to perform functions, and it's not just that they're there as checks and balances, there's a lot of work that goes into preparing speeches. There's a lot of work that goes into, as I said before, when I was in the Senate, you had people calling, suggesting, requesting. That takes up your time. It's not just speeches that we say, no, right, because unless they stand in orders of change, we're not supposed to read speeches. Right? But we have to have research. Who wants to sit down and listen to me stand up there and go on and on and on about a disabled person, when I can give them statistics, when I can discuss other things, when I can talk about women's rights and issues and follow the international, sitting down, subscribing to journals, and all of those things are expensive undertakings. And if you want people to give you the best, you have to give them better compensation. That is I'm smiling at the 1,500 because in my days, it wasn't even that. So,
It wasn't even that.
it wasn't even that. As Deputy President, and I make no shame, the Clerk of Parliament might slap me for it. No, he wouldn't. He's a nice guy. But as Deputy President, my remuneration was $1,400 a month.
I get 15.
But well, there you go. So the 1,500 is that's only the Deputy President. You're not really tackling the rest of the issue. So no,
The others
it is
get
not
12,
adequate.
I think.
It's 12. $1,200, less than adequate.
So there you have it, the notion that we make so much more money than everybody else and so much more money than the British, but thank you for that. I think you need to send the link to the media and perhaps to the Leader of the Opposition. Our chairman wants the microphone.
I just want to add that part of the reason why there seems to be no sympathy out there for any increase for parliamentarians is that people don't have a full knowledge and understanding of what it is they do and how often they're involved in Parliament's business. Many years ago, a very prominent Barbadian headed a committee looking into parliamentarian salary and so on. And he proceeded on the premise that the only time they work is on Tuesdays. So he didn't see why any lot of money should be given to them. The only time they work is Tuesdays. And I am not sure that he was alone in that view of what parliamentarians do. If you are on two committees in Parliament, you may not only work if you were, for example, a member of the House on Tuesdays, but the House several times meet more than one day a week. But apart from that, the committee, your involvement in committees may cause you some weeks to spend 15, 20 hours doing Parliament's business. But that is not widely known, and this very prominent and highly distinguished gentleman who gave his thoughts on what we should be earning as parliamentarians. It's about they only work one day a week, and that's on Tuesday. That was a wholly mistaken view. For a man at the very highest level of the society, you would have thought he knew better. But that view might be widely shared by others in the community, so that we need to somehow educate our public more than we have done in the past as to what exactly it is that we do and how often are we involved in the business of Parliament. And I think that that is important.
Well, that may be a good note on which to draw our panel to a close and ask our Commissioner, Maxine McLean, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and I will very briefly preface my thank yous by indicating that both tonight and last week, I believe, would have been extremely educational for Barbadians and others on the role of members of Parliament and, in fact, the role of the Senate. Having said that, I want to start by thanking our Chairman of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Sir Richard Cheltenham, for being here with us and offering opening remarks, which basically would have contextualized the discussion, to our very distinguished panel of women presenters, and I choose not to use the word ladies. Lady is a term often earned, but earned in a very particular kind of way because of a sir. So, but if you would prefer, I would really want to say that having this panel would have also demonstrated the capacity of our females, and that is not a secret. Our educational system continues to reflect that. If we look at our university system, almost 3/4 of our students and graduates are females. But it's been a pleasure sitting in this particular panel for me to listen to former President of the Senate, Carrie Ann Eiffel, who in herself was a trailblazer. She has not only demonstrated for 10 years in my presence, but tonight, that she has a full grasp of the issues relating to the Senate and is not afraid to share her thoughts. I believe that her contribution would have also demonstrated the importance of the Senate, and she also offered based on her personal experience, the rationale for retaining the Senate. And that was balanced by an examination, and I thank Dr. Sandra Osheng Springer for her overview of the contribution of the Senate, and more specifically, looking at the issue of female underrepresentation. And that, in a sense, in the context of Barbados, unlike other jurisdictions, is one that perhaps is a kind of contradiction, given the point I made earlier about the role that women continue to play in the educational system. And to my former schoolmate, Vera Brathwaite, I think your overview, again, reinforcing the importance of the Senate, has also added to a better understanding. And therefore, taken together, we would have been treated to an appreciation that, in fact, the Senate is not a talk shop, but it serves a very important place in a bicameral system. And as Dr. Chandler asked, if not that, what? And how would we configure our system to ensure what our current system holds? To our audience, those with us physically, and I recognize members of government, to take time to be with us, government, that is both houses of parliament, to take time to be with us is important. To our commissioners, you have been faithful. Sarah, you're on the far corner, but, oh, I see. But I believe that it is a demonstration of your commitment to this very significant exercise. And to our audience, I also want to say thank you to the members of the Barbados Police Service, to oversight, which makes sure that these meetings are covered well, and I can tell you that the audiences continue to express their interest. To all others, the staff of Parliament who work day and night. We see you all the time, and like the members of the House and Senate, your role is also one that is almost 24/7. An MP's job is 24/7, and certainly in a small country like this, we rely very much on a small cadre of persons to deliver. Overall, I will say thank you to all who have made this possible. And I did write her name down at Paula Medford. I wrote it down as soon as you said it, because we have sought to be inclusionary in our communication. And to our sign language interpreter, Ms. Medford, I say thank you very much. And we look forward to having that service provided at all times, and again to oversight. And to everybody who continue to make it their business to follow this work, I say thank you. I wish you a safe trip home for those who are with us physically, and look forward to seeing you next Thursday. We will be at the Lester Vaughan School, and there we will be talking about the role and purpose and importance of cabinet, among other issues. We find that these sessions will seriously contribute to the work, so we call on you to share your thoughts both in these meetings, but more importantly, if you cannot be with us, in writing, because it will aid us in really understanding what Barbadians want to see in terms of changes and improvements, which basically redound to an improvement of our democracy and better serving our people. So with those words, thanks again to all, and a special thank you to our moderator, Her Excellency Elizabeth Thompson, and we look forward to you joining us either here or virtually, and asking of your friends and colleagues to pay some attention. You can go back and view our previous meetings and share your thoughts with us. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies. You are welcome.